Welcome now to Access Utah. I'm Tom Williams. Today we're presenting our fourth live episode of Debunked. It's the only Utah podcast combining evidence-based health practices with storytelling to challenge the stereotypes and debunk the myths about harm reduction, substance use disorders, and homelessness. And today we're welcoming in a Debunked host, Don Lyons. Don, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Tom, good to be here and good to be with you again.
And Don, I think you're going to welcome in our other guests here. I'll just alert you that we don't have Lynette on the line here. I'll keep trying to get her.
All right, no problem. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, welcome everybody to Debunked. We're looking at debunking the myth here that there are plenty of resources, but people just don't want help. So we have Heather is on the line, I believe. So Heather, thank you for joining us, and welcome to Debunked. And if you can give an introduction of yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. My name is Heather Hogue, and I live in Provo, and I work for United Way of Utah County. The program I work with is called the Continuum of Care, and it's a coalition of agencies in Utah County, Summit County, and Wasatch County that touch on different facets of homelessness. Personally, I've been working with homelessness for the last 14 years in Utah County, so I have a special interest in housing and substance use treatment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Heather. Thanks again for joining us. You know, before we get into debunking the myth, I'm always really grateful for people like yourself, Heather, out there doing this work in the community on the ground. I'm just curious of what drew you to this type of work.
That's a great question. My last semester of college, I took a part-time job at a soup kitchen. I figured I'd be there a couple of months before I applied for graduate school. And, it changed my whole career path. Within just a few days of working with individuals experiencing homelessness, I felt like it was a place I could really make a difference. And it really meant a lot for me to have somewhere to go for work every day where I knew that just being there was going to make a difference in somebody's life. And so it was a very unexpected career choice for me, and one that's been really rewarding and challenging. But, man, I've learned a lot.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like it was the passion kind of picked you. Which is really great. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, again, I really appreciate the work that you do, and I'm excited to learn more about what you're doing and helping us debunk this myth that there's a lot of resources, but people just don't want help. So let's get right into it. And Tom, let me know if Lynette's able to join. We'll bring her right into the conversation.
Yes, I believe Lynette should be here. Let's try this. Go ahead, Lynette.
Okay.
Good morning, guys.
Hey, Lynette, good morning. Welcome. Welcome to Debunk here. We're just doing a round of introductions, so you're right on time here. Heather, introduce yourself. Would you like to introduce yourself, Lynette?
Sure. Thank you, guys, for having me today. My name is Lynette Denton. I am a certified peer support specialist in Moab, Utah, and I work as a recovery coach for USARA, which is Utah Support Advocates for Recovery Awareness. The reason that I'm here today is to share my story. I have been the person that has needed to use many resources in order to get back on my feet or stay afloat. And as a young single parent with a colorful background and history, it hasn't always been easy. I have overcome so many challenges and obstacles in my lifetime to get where I'm at today that it is truly just an honor to be able to use my lived experience to help others and navigate them through their life journey.
Thanks so much, Lynette. And we're so blessed to have you here and being able to share your aspects of your story. And I think it goes a long way to for people to hear other people's personal stories. And sometimes we feel like we're alone out there. So your story is powerful, and we look forward to hearing from aspects of that story here today. So I wanted to start, Lynette, with yourself here. You shared a little bit of your background. Could you could you just explain to our audience and share, what you're comfortable with? Is how did substance use disorders affect your life?
Well, my life was very chaotic and hard. Growing up, I started using substances at a very young age. Back then, signs weren't really known regularly, so I just kind of came off as unruly and a destructive child. I spent a lot of time in juvenile detentions growing up, and I dropped out of high school at 16 because I was pregnant. Coming from such a small town where everyone knows everybody, jobs were hard to get, and because of substance use, if I did get a job, they were hard to keep. I had lots of DCFS cases, kind of back-to-back abusive relationships. Life was pretty hard growing up because of substance use disorder.
Yeah, thanks, Lynette. Lynette, when you were getting treatment, if you can share with the listeners here, what resources were available when you're undergoing treatment?
The resources that were available to me was drug court, DCFS, and Four Corners. So I was arrested for domestic violence and put on probation. And during my time on probation, I was unable to stay sober. And so I tried to hide it, but I couldn't. And eventually I got a DUI, which led to a probation violation. And then I was faced with either finishing out whatever my original sentence would have been in my first court hearing, or I could go to drug court. And so I went to drug court. Drug court would help supply me with tools and support and the structure that I needed. However, it was very challenging at the same time. I remember trying to get to all of my appointments and classes and UAs and meetings and work, and it was extra stressful. I didn't have my driver's license, and Moab doesn't offer any transportation. I couldn't find a place to live, and they have drug trackers that come to check on you, and you're not allowed. Associations are a big part of drug court, so you can't really be around people that I knew from my past. So those couch opportunities and a safe place to lay my head was hard to find. I just couldn't find a place to live. I remember filling out a ton of applications and was just rejected over and over again because of my history and charges. It was extremely discouraging. Moab Solutions is a resource that helps families in emergency situations, and so I can remember when they were they helped me out with a motel room for a few days, and I just remember being super thankful for that. But then after the couple days, it was just kind of back to the uncertainty of where to lay my head. So even though I had some resources available to me, my main life domain areas weren't getting met, and so it was really, really an extra struggle to stay focused and do what I had to do to get through what I had to get through to stay out of jail. So it was a challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Lynette. That's a powerful story aspect. There's multiple layers of situations, and connecting the dots and trying to navigate that, as an individual is really hard in the various systems. So I can hear the passion that you have for being a peer support to help others through the situations and navigating supports. I'm curious, before I move on to Heather here, I want to stay with you, Lynette. I've grown up in alcoholic families, and substance use disorder is pretty heavy in my family. And I remember at different points, especially my dad would say, this was the turning point that I knew that I was wanting to change the direction I was going. I'm curious, Lynette, was there a moment for you that this is where I want to change the direction of my life?
Absolutely. the end of my addiction was super dark and just a really hard place to be. I woke up every day just not even wanting to be here anymore. And so when I got that last DUI, and then I was faced with prison or and losing my children, or really fighting to get better, that was absolutely my turning point. I had actually done drug court in 2005 before and successfully completed that. And I knew that this was an opportunity for me to try to get my life back. And I loved my kids so much. The thought of losing them was more than I could bear. And I just felt like if I didn't take that opportunity and get better then, I don't know. I can't quite say that I would still be here if I was still in my addiction and didn't take that opportunity. I just felt like I was at the end of my addiction one way or another. So that was definitely my turning point.
Yeah, thanks, Lynette. I'm glad you're here, Lynette. We're here for your kids and being able to share your story. And again, thank you for your strength and being able to do that for other people.
Yeah, me too.
I wanted to turn to Heather. You work at United Way, and I want to dive into the questions about resources because we're debunking the myth, the idea that there's plenty of resources, people just don't want to help. So Heather, you have some experience working in rural areas of Utah where there might be high rates of substance use disorder there. And could you talk about the resources or maybe the lack of that are in those rural areas in Utah?
Yeah, definitely. Particularly in rural areas of Utah, there really are a lack of resources. Even in bigger areas, like I live in Provo, there are not a whole lot of medical detox beds. Something I learned pretty early on that was a surprise to me, that there are types of substance use disorders that actually require medical detox, like alcohol. If people have experienced alcohol dependency for any length of time, it's dangerous to cold turkey them. You have to medically detox. And so even in these bigger areas they're more urban and less rural, you just don't have the resources for things like that. So when you look at these rural communities that maybe don't have the population, the budget, the infrastructure that some of the more urban areas do, in general, we're really not prioritizing those resources in our communities. And I think that's a really multifaceted issue. In my experience, a lot of people struggle to identify themselves as having a substance use disorder. So I think it goes greatly unreported. And then I think people also fear seeking help because of stigma or uncertainty. And so therefore we have communities that don't really see what a serious problem it is, right in our backyard. And I think in many ways we as a society are still kind of coming to terms with substance use disorders being an illness rather than a moral failing. We expect that people are going to be able to will their way out of or just quit cold turkey, and that's just not reality. So until our communities are really committing to treating substance use disorders as an illness, unfortunately, we're just not prioritizing treatment.
100%. Thank you, Heather. I want to ask one more question if we can. I'm looking at talking to my partner here, Tom. I know we're getting close to the break here, but if I can sneak in one question for you as a follow-up, Heather. Could you talk about the connection between the lack of resources and that might impact people's willingness to seek support, and kind of the connection between the lack of resources and discouraging someone from seeking treatment?
Absolutely. One of the things that people don't realize is that help is hard to find. And just a few weeks ago, I had a call from a friend that was looking for help for her daughter. She was finally sort of accepting she needed help with substance abuse treatment. But the daughter doesn't have insurance. She doesn't qualify for financial assistance. She couldn't find anywhere that would take her for inpatient because she's going to have to medically detox from what she's dealing with. So it's kind of an unfortunate reality that human beings who are wanting help can't get it due to lack of resources or lack of affordability. I mean, I'm like in services, and I spent hours on the phone trying to find a place that we could send her daughter to. And we didn't find anywhere. I don't know where she ended up going. I don't know what they ended up doing. But this is me as like a social worker trying to find this. Imagine someone being in crisis and having to call and expend emotional resources here that they keep getting rejected, and they don't have the money or they don't have the connection, and they're in crisis. They've used all of their emotional reserves by admitting that they have a problem and that they need help, and then it's one closed door after another. And, I think Lynette mentioned a really important factor, too. We don't consider the challenges that start coming into people's lives when they have a substance use disorder, like transportation. They don't have a driver's license to go to different places. They may not have internet access. They may have limited phone minutes. It's hard for me to understand now with my unlimited data plans and everything. But there are a lot of people that have a finite number of minutes on their phone that are paid for, and they can't afford to pay for more. There's so many of these little micro challenges that are involved with seeking help, and the resources are so limited in the first place that it becomes very difficult for people to navigate that system on their own. And if they don't have an advocate, or even if they do have an advocate, the resources sometimes are just not there or not equipped to deal with their needs.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Tom, I think we're ready for one of those breaks. Are we right?
Yeah.
Here?
Yes, just about ready. Before we go to break, and let's just reset the scene. You're listening to Access Utah, obviously. I'm Tom Williams, and we are presenting a live episode of the podcast Debunked, which debunks myths surrounding harm reduction. And today we're debunking the myth there are plenty of resources, but people just don't want to help. And so, Don, before we go to break, I just want to ask you, what are some available resources for those seeking substance abuse disorder treatment in the tribal communities?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's pretty similar to what Heather was sharing. It's the lack of infrastructure, and I think Heather's point, and Lynette talked about it too from a firsthand experience, is those micro systems and those micro infrastructure on a personal level to get to point A to point B. That's a real thing. In tribal communities, we have the mental health services from the Indian Health Services, but historically the Indian Health Services is super underfunded. It's only funded at 50% of where it needs to be funded to service its communities. But there are still mental health facilities there. Lack of treatment beds is a real thing in a lot of tribal communities when the need is there. But tribes also have access to traditional medicine and traditional forms of recovery and healing. Some of those could be sweat lodges, language tables, various ceremonies. And there's close to 600 federally recognized tribes, so each tribe is unique in its own way. But a lot of tribal communities and also urban communities have access to, traditional healers and traditional helping services. There's also well-briety, which is a big movement in Indian country, and the Red Road recovery. So there is few important resources within tribal communities to help folks. But what Heather talked about, the infrastructure, the need to invest. And also to invest not just in the brick and mortar of the buildings, but also in highly skilled folks that are willing to work in tribal communities and help out. So, yeah, there's some resources, but there's opportunity for definitely improvement and growth there.
Well, let's take that break that Don mentioned. We have with us Don Lyons. He is host of the podcast Debunked. We also have with us Lynette Denton, who's with USARA, Utah Support Advocates for Recovery Awareness, and Heather Hogue with United Way of Utah County. This is a live episode of Debunked on Utah Public Radio and Access Utah, and we're debunking the myth. There are plenty of resources, but people just don't want to help. We're going to, after the break, come back and talk about stigma associated with substance use disorders. That'll happen following this break.
Programming on Utah Public Radio is made possible in part by our members and Auto Evolution, owned and operated by Ron Stagg, keeping Cache Valley automobiles on the road for more than 20 years with service, repair, and maintenance. Located at 347 West Airport Road in North Logan. Information is available by calling 435-753-2521.
Join us here on Utah Public Radio throughout the week for Utah State University Extension's Ask an Expert, featuring timely information from raising your own backyard chickens to keeping our waterways clean and tips promoting mental wellness at work. If you've missed the latest segment for the week, you can find all the Ask an Expert features on our website, upr.org, and on our UPR app.
I'm Jay Ellison, producer of The Moth Radio Hour, and I hope you'll join us for our show here on Utah Public Radio, with true personal stories told live without notes to standing room crowds around the world. Moth shows are renowned for the range of human experience they reveal. That's The Moth Radio Hour, Saturday evening at 6, right here on Utah Public Radio.
You're listening to Access Utah. I'm Tom Williams, and we're presenting another live episode of the podcast Debunked. That's the only Utah podcast combining evidence-based health practices with storytelling to challenge the stereotypes and debunk the myths about harm reduction, substance abuse disorders, and homelessness. And we have with us Debunked host Don Lyons. We also have with us Lynette Denton, who is with USARA, and Heather Hogue, who is with United Way of Utah County. And we're glad that you have joined us today. Listen to this live episode of Debunked. So I'd just like to jump in here. I'll go to Lynette first. And I wonder if you could describe what stigmas you've faced relating to having a substance use disorder.
So where do I begin? I know that in my addiction, I heard a lot of junkie, common criminal, troublemaker, worthless, bad mom, once a junkie, always a junkie. I'm still currently facing some stigma, and as of today's my 7-year recovery day. And so, but still facing some of the stigma. For instance, I have 3 felonies on my record that I'll have forever because when I was arrested, I gave a positive UA sample and was charged with internal possession, which were felonies back then. And because of the domestic violence, just the stuff that kind of comes with addiction, I don't qualify for an expungement. And so I'm permanently branded as a criminal. So just those kind of stigmas are things that I faced, and I still see the stigma today with being a recovery coach. Like in our rural area, harm reduction is something that is fairly new to Moab. It's just been kind of starting to be learned about and known in the last couple of years, and we face a lot of pushback and a lot of stigma about enabling addiction and all of this kind of stuff. And so the stigma is still very, very thick today. And it can, I believed the things that people told me back then. And it took a long time. In fact, I still work really hard today to, for positive self-talk and that I do belong here, and just knowing I'm enough. Those things are so embedded in me, just deep ingrained in my soul. And so I work through them every day as a coach. That's what I try to help others through as well. But stigma's pretty deep here.
I have a follow-up question. So you now work as a coach with folks. How do you help them to overcome stigma?
Well, we as USARA, as a team, are really focused on positive language and building up people's self-esteem, and but like in the community, also giving presentations a lot about positive language. So lots of role play, lots of setting goals, lots of positive affirmations, and also just educating the participant and the community as a whole about stigmatizing languages and how to overcome this. And it's definitely challenging, but you can, once you see the participants start to, like the change in them from the stigma to knowing like their worth and their value, it's the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen. And so we just work really hard in those areas in particular.
I want to turn to Heather next. I wonder if you could speak to how stigma has impacted people with substance use disorders in rural areas.
Absolutely. I think one of the difficulties with substance use disorder is that as a society, we tend to think about it as a moral failing and not as an illness. When you're in a small town or a small community, everybody knows everybody. You go to the pharmacy and it's, your stepsister's cousin, everybody knows everybody. So people feel like not only are they not worthy of help because they have this moral failing that we sort of impose upon them, they're also worried about sort of tangible things like losing their job, losing their status in a community, losing their religious group, losing their family members if they seek help. Because while seeking help shouldn't be a secret thing, it should be a private thing if an individual chooses for it to be so. But when you get into these smaller and more rural communities, that's not always the way that works, because everybody knows everybody.
Let me turn to Don. What are some of the stigmas people with substance use disorders face in tribal areas?
Yeah, it's pretty similar to what Heather was talking about. That's kind of where I want to start. It's the small-knit, close communities, even in big urban settings. I'm from Detroit. Detroit, Chicago, LA are some of the main hubs. Minneapolis, during the relocation era, where tribes people were sent there to work in factories. Even in these big urban areas, it's a close-knit community, so people do know what's happening, and that's both a protective factor and also potentially a risk factor, especially when it's talking about seeking help in the community for everything that Heather was talking about, losing status or not feeling a sense of belonging or shame in going and seeking support with a substance use disorder. The other thing is words have power, and I think Lynette did a good job explaining that, how she works through as a peer support. And also Heather talked about society, where how we talk about things is generally how we think about things. And we need to understand that words have power. I was a behavioral health director for a little bit in an urban clinic, and I always tell the clinicians I was overseeing is we have to be careful when we diagnose people because it becomes a naming ceremony. Traditionally in a lot of indigenous communities, you get multiple names. You get names at birth. Maybe when you get older, you go through different ceremonies. You get another name. And going way back, traditionally, if you go to different communities, people have different names for you based on, what you bring to that community and how people see you. But those naming ceremonies are really important because when you get those names, they kind of call you to be something. And when we're diagnosing people, I think sometimes when we're not very clear and don't have all the information, we're almost kind of blaming and shaming in different ways. I know there's a need for billing and all those things, but we just have to be careful how we use words. In tribal communities, there's a reawakening of bringing back language, indigenous languages in communities, and our languages are really verb-based, meaning that you're talking about your relationship to something, not about a thing. Because English is about nouns and naming something. In a lot of indigenous communities, it's about your relationship to things. So I think that goes a little bit, goes a long way to kind of break down the stigma in tribal communities, to understand the relationship of how we need to support each other and a sense of belonging. There's also elements of racism in a lot of communities, especially communities that border, predominantly non-native communities. And that racism is another form of stigma. There's the old saying, drunk Indian, and that has a long history. The settlers came in and provided alcohol and the means to just take the land away, to sign paper when there's no understanding of exactly what was going on in tribal communities, and that ripples through the generations there. And there's also idea that because of historical trauma and lateral violence in tribal communities, that sometimes unhealthy norms are normalized, meaning that, growing up in an alcoholic family, that's normal. That's just how it is. That's the way it needs to be. And that's difficult to break, but it is possible to break that. And that goes to stigma and the help-seeking behaviors. And I think Heather talked about it, is we think that substance use disorders is a moral failing. But it's an illness. And if we start thinking about in that way, it helps us understand that it's not what's wrong, but what happened. And once we understand what happened, we can get more to actually building bridges and access to help and support. When we think of what's wrong with you, we hear that, and if we're all honest, we've probably said that at different points. What's wrong with you? But that gets the blame and shame. And Lynette talked about, the self-talk is a real thing. And we have to remind ourselves we are worthy to seek help. We are worthy to live a sober life. We are worthy to be reconnected to our families and communities. And that goes a long way to break down stigma at the individual level, and then at community level too, creating that healthy space to be trauma-informed, to tackle those things is important.
Then before we go to the next section here, I want to have us talk a little bit about the terminology we're using. Hopefully we're trying to set a good example here, right, on the podcast. And people may notice that we're, instead of saying substance abuse, we're saying substance use. Instead of saying drug dependence, we're using the term substance use disorder. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. That's where words have power. If we start educating ourselves and talking about things different, then we can start thinking about these things different, and we're thinking about it different, then we can really go about changing the dynamics of things. So you're right. Years past, there was drug dependence, drug abuse, drug habits, but that really goes to that deficit mindset of looking at always dependent on something. And if we're really about change, then we need to build on the resilient factors. It's not meaning that we're glossing over the issues, but we're focusing on what's the positive things? How can we frame things with building off the resilience? And the substance use disorder kind of lends ourselves to understand the resilient factors, that it's not a blame and shame about an individual, but it's about the individual might be struggling with this illness, and how do we create ladders and bridges of support and be there for that person and see the humanity in people. So another example is, it's clean or dirty. We've heard that before, talking about substance use disorders, and use and unused. And we're trying to get those languages, those words have a really strong, powerful way to break down stigma in communities. A couple other ones, addict, abuser, user. I've grown up in families that have kind of changed cycles, and people in recovery use that way to describe it, which is perfectly fine. But folks, in trying to help other people, we'd be mindful of how we use the words and how we have to recognize each other's humanity. And I think the changing of how we're describing things will help us get there a little bit quicker. So I'm on board with trying to understand and speak in a different way, because we got to continue to find ways to support each other and recognize each other and really help each other. And Heather, conversations about rural Utah, it's really similar to tribal communities. Some of them are rural places, but some of them are not, and also an urban setting. So if we start using this language, what I hope is that we can see that we have a lot more in common than differences, and that will go a long way, too, to break down stigma.
Well, let's take another break. When we come back, more, of course, on the podcast. It's Access Utah. I'm Tom Williams. We're presenting another live episode of Debunked, which debunks myths regarding harm reduction. And the myth we're busting today is there are plenty of resources, but people don't want to help. When we come back, we'll ask about some experiences in finding housing. This season of the episode, we're talking about substance use disorder, harm reduction, and homelessness. So we'll talk about that aspect. We're going to be talking, hopefully, time permitting, about harm reduction, that term, and all of that following this break.
Programming on Utah Public Radio is made possible in part by our members and Stokes Nature Center Canyon Jams, presenting Highline Drifters, August 6th at 7 p.m., located at Von Bear Park in Providence. Information at logannature.org/Canyon Jams.
Hello, listeners. I'm Shireen Gorbani, Salt Lake County Councilwoman. Join us for Both Sides of the Aisle. This is a weekly debate over politics, policy, and big issues facing the state of Utah, featuring voices on the right, in the center, and on the left. That's me. Both Sides of the Aisle attempts to help you understand the important questions facing the residents of this state. We prove that you can still put Republicans and Democrats in a small room and have meaningful dialogue. Thursday mornings at 10 a.m. on Utah Public Radio.
I'm Jasmine Mesa, one of the bilingual reporters at Utah Public Radio. This year we have been working on increasing the diversity of voices you hear on UPR, and that is where I come in. I produce news stories in Spanish each week, and right now I've been reporting a lot of COVID-19. But as things continue to open up, I will be reporting on community events and other resources. Tune in on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. to listen to my stories in Spanish, and visit upr.org to read them in English.
Thanks for listening to Access Utah. I'm Tom Williams. We're presenting a live episode of the podcast Debunked. That's the only Utah podcast combining evidence-based health practices with storytelling to challenge the stereotypes and debunk the myths about harm reduction, substance use disorders, and homelessness. This time we're debunking the myth there are plenty of resources, but people just don't want the help. We're joined by the podcast co-host Don Lyons. We're also talking with Lynette Denton, who's a coach with the Utah Support Advocates for Recovery Awareness, or USARA, and Heather Hogue, who is with United Way of Utah County. Let me just mention here, before I turn it over to Don for the next segment, the Debunked podcast was created by Utah State University Office of Health Equity and Community Engagement and Tribal and Rural Opioid Initiative, which are housed within the USU Emma Eccles Jones College of Education and Human Resources, Department of Kinesiology and Health Science, and USU Extension. The program was made possible by SAMHSA, Utah Public Radio, and community partners. So, Don, take it away for the next segment.
All right. Thanks, Tom. I want to go to Lynette. Prior you talked about housing, and Heather did a good job talking about those in-between items to get us to the point of seeking help and getting access and things like that. I want to specifically start drawing in on the housing issues that you might have had in the past, Lynette, and if you could share what resources were available to help you get some stable housing.
Has always been, it was a nightmare when I was first trying to get back on my feet, and still today. I think if I had a magic wand for all of the participants that I work with, it would be a housing magic wand. When I first got out of jail, and I knew I was going to be going into drug court, I was able to stay with a friend, but only for 2 weeks. And then because of my long history of domestic violence, I was actually able to stay at a women's shelter that we have here locally, but they had, and it was so safe and amazing. It was like the first safe place I had been in years, but 90 days was their limit. And so, and today, that's no longer an option for women unless you have experienced domestic violence in the past 30 days. So I actually really lucked out when I was first trying to establish housing. However, I mentioned before, I applied to many different housing options. In fact, when I got out of jail, I went over to the Housing Authority and I just, I applied for every single kind of housing option that they had. Section 8, low income, those self-help build your owns. And I was denied all of them, at least all of the low income and the Section 8. For our Section 8, it was this huge waiting list, about 3-year waiting list in order to get to that. And by the time I came up on that, they had been, they have gone through multiple employees and somehow my name got lost. And so I had to start over on that list, which was pretty devastating, although with my felonies, I wouldn't have qualified for it anyway. But eventually, because all the housing options kind of crashed out on me, I took a job in a laundry position in a hotel, and it was notoriously known as one of the worst employers in Moab. But I took it because housing was an option. They provided housing. So I took the job because I had to have somewhere to live. And when I got into the trailer that they provided for housing, the walls were covered in mold. The floors were falling in. But I just remember feeling super grateful for that moment because now I had a chance to try to move forward and get my kids back, which were in DCFS custody at the time. And I did manage to clean it up, and make it somewhat of a home for myself. But that was those were my housing options when I was trying to get back on my feet in the beginning. And so to fast forward 6 years, though, I actually filled out one of the self-help builds. And 6 years after I filled it out, I got a phone call asking if I was still interested in building my own home. And over those 6 years, I was reestablishing myself in the community as sober and building up my credit and doing all the things that I needed to do to improve my life again. And so I actually qualified for that self-help build and am currently building my own home right now and due to move in August 20th. So that's pretty exciting. But to get to this moment was so hard. I don't even know how else to explain it other than just devastating and just so challenging.
That's fantastic. Congratulations on that. That's exciting and quite the 180. And thank you for sharing the importance of having stable housing is an essential building block to get people on steady ground and continue to move forward in a healthy way. Heather, real quick, I want to pivot to you. And Lynette shared some of the barriers and some of the issues that she had to walk through to get her to the point where she's at now. And Heather, if you could just share some of the items that you think, what could be done to lessen the burden, lessen the barriers for folks like Lynette to get stable housing and get the support they need to get on the right track there?
We have to stop thinking of housing as a reward for good behavior and think about housing as a human right. And when we have that shift in our mindset as a society, a lot of these barriers are going to fall away. Her story is one I've heard 100 times about people struggling to find housing and not being able to find housing or qualify for projects if you're lucky enough to have Section 8 vouchers in your rural community. I mean, housing is a human right. We have to start thinking about it that way.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, how we think is actually depends. We change our actions and we change our thinking. So thank you for sharing that. Well, Tom, I want to give it back to you here. I know we got a couple more questions and we're getting close on time.
Certainly so, yes. Getting to the end of here. Just quickly, I'll turn to Lynette first on this one. What does the term harm reduction mean to you?
So harm reduction to me is meeting people where they're at and just loving them with no expectations and trying to keep them safe just by reducing negative consequences associated with drug use.
And same question to you, Heather.
I think Lynette said it wonderfully. I think about it keeping people as healthy and safe as possible until they're ready and able to make long-term addressing of barriers in their lives.
Don, I think in the interest of time, I think those were very well said answers. Why don't we go to the next the next question?
Yeah, definitely. This is Lynette and Heather. I think we've been trying to be consistent asking a similar question of this for folks coming on Debunked here. But let me start with Lynette. You did an awesome job explaining harm reduction in a very accessible way for people who might have just heard it for the first time. Just thinking for people out there listening, for our audience, what things, what can we do to help? Maybe it's a relative, maybe it's a close friend that are struggling with substance use disorder, and what words of advice would you give to those family members, and maybe someone who's listening on Debunk right now might be struggling themselves with that. So just some words of wisdom and some encouragement, and we'll start with Lynette.
I would say the best way to support people would be just love them, no matter what. Support them, help guide them through the challenges that they face. Mostly remind them that they matter in a world that's so condemning. There are a lot of resources to help support individuals that are struggling with substance use. And if it's hard or frustrating, just help guide them to resources that can help support them, or I don't know, patience and love is what's going to help support them the best. Try to meet them where they're at.
Yeah, that goes a long way. Heather, I want to pivot to you here before we start wrapping up. It's kind of a similar question, but I think I want to ask you if you're speaking to someone who's a believer in this myth, to believe that, there's just a lot of resources and people just don't want help. How would you approach that person? What would you say?
I would say if you're lucky enough to not have loved ones who are struggling to find support and help, then pay that good fortune forward and volunteer to help individuals in your community that are struggling. Look for agencies in your community that work with poverty. Donate your time. And through service and experience, you're going to gain understanding and some perspective.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, getting, understanding, putting yourselves in people's shoes goes a long way to helping other folks. Tom, I think we're getting close to the time frame here, and I'm watching my watch here, and I want to follow your lead. But we're looking at, there's plenty of resources, but people just don't want the help with today's myth. And thanks for Heather and Lynette to help us explore this and debunking this myth today. But I'll hand it over to you, Tom, for any last words, any questions we can sneak in there.
I think we're just about out of time here, so I think covered the topic very, very well. We've had with us on the program today Lynette Denton, who is a coach with USARA in Moab. That's Utah Support Advocates for Recovery Awareness. Lynette Denton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys so much for having me. This is such an important conversation to have, and I'm just really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. And Heather Hogue has been with us. She's with United Way of Utah County. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we, of course, have had with us the host of Debunked, Don Lyons. Don, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Lynette and Heather, for joining us. Another great sharing on Debunked here.
And we'll be back next month with another live episode of Debunked right here on Access Utah. So stay tuned for details on that. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Just one more time, give the credits here. Debunked is the only podcast in Utah, combining evidence-based health practices and with storytelling to challenge the stereotypes, debunk the myths about harm reduction, substance use disorders, and homelessness. And the Debunked podcast was created by the Utah State University Office of Health Equity and Community Engagement and Tribal and Rural Opioid Initiative, which are housed within the USU Emma Eccles Jones College of Education and Human Services, Department of Kinesiology and Health Science, and USU Extension. The program is made possible by SAMHSA, Utah Public Radio, and community partners. And thanks, everyone, for listening today to Access Utah.
Programming on Utah Public Radio is made possible in part by our members and Utah Tourism Association, advocating Utah's visitor economy and hosting the annual live Utah Tourism Conference, August 10th through the 13th in Ogden, featuring breakout sessions, destination discovery, and events registration. Information available at utah.tourismconference.com.
Are you looking for a way to make your nonprofit organization more visible to our statewide community? Well, we'd love to support your events on our UPR community calendar. Head to upr.org, click on the community calendar tab, and there you can find the submission link. We highlight events including workshops, theater, art shows, dances, lectures, virtual events, and more. Again, you can just go to the community calendar tab on upr.org to submit your event.
This is Utah Public Radio, a statewide service of Utah State University and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, KUSR Logan, KUSK Vernal, KUSL Richfield, KUST Moab, KCEU Price, KUSU FM Logan, and also heard at upr.org.